150 years ago, on November 2nd, 1875, the placid waters of the Perak River ran red with blood. In an outburst of Malay rage, James Wheeler Woodford Birch, Her Britannic Majesty's first resident of Perak, was killed by an angry crowd in the village of Pasir Salak. His death sent shockwaves through the British Empire and plunged Perak into a brief but brutal war. It was as much a clash of civilizations as it was a clash of arms, and its outcome would change the destiny of the Malay Peninsula and reshape the fate of its people. This is the story of that single violent moment that led to this war. Our story begins in January 1874 aboard the colonial steamer Pluto, anchored off the island of Pangkor in Perak. There, the Malay rulers of Perak signed an agreement aimed at bringing the tin-rich state under British protection and ushering in relative peace. This was nearly after a decade of bloody clashes between rival Chinese clans during the Larut Wars and intractable succession disputes among the Malay chiefs. The treaty's noble goal was to bring order and stability to Perak. However, it effectively marked the start of direct British intervention in the state and would eventually lead to simmering discontent. The Sultan of Perak, Sultan Abdullah Muhammad Shah II, would rule as a sovereign, but a British resident would advise him on all questions other than those touching Malay religion and custom. To London, it seemed an enlightened policy, a modernizing partnership between the British and the Malay ruler. To many of the Malay chiefs, however, it was a quiet invasion and a stealthy transfer of power from the Sultan to the British resident. The man selected to be that resident, James Wheeler Woodford Birch, was the very epitome of Victorian public service. Efficient, upright, full of crusading zeal, energetic, impatient with delay. Birch's career began in the Royal Navy, where he served as a midshipman before entering the Ceylon Civil Service in 1852. His service in Ceylon was long and varied, encompassing roles such as commissioner, police magistrate, and district judge, culminating in his appointment as government agent of the Eastern Province. This background provided him with lengthy experience as an administrator and intimate acquaintance with life, customs, habits, and people in Asia. In May 1870, Birch was promoted and appointed Colonial Secretary of the Straits Settlements, where he garnered a reputation among his peers for efficiency and moral conviction. When he was selected to be the British resident of Perak, he saw himself as a reformer, bringing order, reason, and justice to a land he viewed as troubled by feudalism and disorder. Few doubted his sincerity. However, many questioned his judgment and sensitivity, with his approach often perceived as overbearing and disrespectful of Malay customs and tradition. The first months of the residency were calm on the surface, but resentment smouldered beneath. He established a police force and introduced a new civil code, insisting that disputes be settled in courts, not by customs. His every decree chipped away at the authority of the old chiefs. Birch abolished the system by which local headmen collected customs, duties, taxes, and other revenue, a right they had held for generations, and placed revenue collection under British administration. What he saw as progress, they saw as humiliation. The chiefs of Perak, proud and independent, soon saw in him not an advisor, but a ruler. One stark example of Birch's approach with the Malay chiefs stands out. In December 1874, Birch heard that a local chief, Rajangah, was illegally taxing tin exports. Determined to make an example, Birch ordered the man's house at Bidor burned to the ground. As a warning to others, he said. But Rajangah was no petty offender. A relative of the ex-Sultan Ismail and holder of the title Tunku Panglima Besar, he later claimed the right to levy taxes, and Birch had punished him without hearing his defense. Even his contemporaries criticized the act as heavy-handed. In London, Lord Stanley of Alderley told the House of Lords that he was appalled Birch had to resort to strong measures such as burning the houses of headmen, adding dryly that the resident appeared to be advising by burning. Raja Yusof and the ex-Sultan Ismail protested the burning, claiming the house was theirs. In his journal, Birch himself later expressed regret over the decision. "I'm not satisfied by any means that it was a wise thing to do," Birch confessed. "I may have made a mistake in doing so." A mistake it certainly was. The burning of this house would later haunt him on the fateful day he made his final trip to Pasir Salak. While the issue of revenue collection was a major cause for resentment among the Malay chiefs, perhaps no policy change cut deeper than Birch's crusade against the practice the British called debt slavery. In truth, it was not the form of slavery as seen in Africa and the Americas at the time, but a form of bonded labor. Those bound by debt were not chained or confined. They often lived in their own homes and moved about with some freedom. Yet, by custom and obligation, these bonded workers or servants were compelled to work for their creditors and were treated, in effect, as their property. Perak's debt slavery system was more akin to the form of bonded labor long practiced in India, where peasants and labourers were bound by hereditary debt or caste obligation to moneylenders, landlords or landowners. Entire families might remain in bondage for generations, a form of social dependence rather than outright captivity. It was one of Perak's darkest social afflictions, forcing the poor into lifelong service to the wealthy. A person might fall into such bondage for many reasons: a gambling debt, a desperate loan, an old family debt, or a fine imposed by a local chief. Once ensnared, escape was almost impossible. No amount of labor could erase the debt. Instead, it passed down like an inheritance. Wives, children, and even grandchildren becoming pusaka, the living property of their masters. Women bound in this way might also be forced into prostitution, their earnings shared or claimed by those to whom they were indebted. Birch described this practice as a crying evil and was determined to end it. He ordered that bonded servants who escaped be protected. He gave sanctuary to runaway slaves at his residency in Bandar Baru, sending many of them to safety in Penang. On one occasion, he even helped several of Sultan Abdullah's female servants, including a woman named Simila, disguise themselves and flee to Pangkor, where he promised them protection. However, each act of emancipation robbed a chief of labor and income. Sultan Abdullah protested that the Sultan was taking away his property. To Birch, it was an act of righteousness. To the chiefs, it was theft. The matter came to a head when the governor pressured Birch to sign a written undertaking to return all fugitives until new laws could be made. Yet Birch did not keep to this agreement for long. True to his principles, he continued to shelter those who fled, insisting he could not stand idle if they complained of cruelty. His campaign to abolish the practice, however, struck at the very foundations of Malay hierarchy, and the chiefs were outraged. By the middle of 1875, the resentment of the chiefs had hardened into conspiracy, and none resented him more than Sultan Abdullah. At Perak River, Sultan Abdullah convened a secret meeting of the Perak chiefs on July 21, 1875, where it was unanimously agreed that Birch had to die and they should drive the British out of Perak forever. Abdullah supplied two chiefs, Maharaja Lela of Pasir Salak and Datuk Sagor at Kampung Gajah, with 2 cases of muskets, several kegs of gunpowder, and rice for the intended murder and revolt. Even as Abdullah sent letters of friendship to the governor in Singapore, his chiefs were sharpening their spears, stockpiling weapons and ammunition, and building stockades. They resolved that Birch must die, and the honour of Perak be restored in blood. Sultan Abdullah and his chiefs were also said to have resorted to a black magic ritual to bring about Birch's death. The ritual in question was called Main Berhantu, literally a ghost play. According to witness testimonies, Sultan Abdullah initiated a series of Main Berhantu rituals in August 1875, held for 3 consecutive nights at his house in Perak River. The explicit purpose of these ceremonies was to forecast, or even cause, Mr. Birch's death. Eyewitness testimonies spoke of a ceremony involving a mannequin made from flour, which the Sultan stabbed repeatedly, saying, "See, in a month Mr. Birch will be dead." In another ritual, a butterfly emerged out of a bowl of rice grains. It was caught in a shaman's hand and crushed. "If the butterfly dies, Mr. Birch will die," the shaman declared. While black magic may not have directly killed Birch, the rituals involved did have a potent power over the minds of those who took part in the killing. In their minds, the butterfly's death foretold Birch's fate, and they believed it would be a certainty that would come to pass just weeks later. With so much resistance to the British reforms that were being implemented, in October 1875, the governor, Sir William Jervois, ordered that Perak would henceforth be administered by British officers in the Sultan's name. proclamations were printed and prepared for posting in every district. To Birch, this was just a matter of administrative procedure. To the chiefs, however, it was a final confirmation that their world was going to be seized. When word spread that the resident himself intended to post the proclamations at Pasir Salak, the very seat of Maharaja Laila's power, many warned him not to go. On the day Birch left for Pasir Salak, November 1st, 1875, he dispatched a message to Governor Jervois in Singapore with these final words: "All quiet. Troops not required." When the Penang government sent news to Governor William Jervois that Birch had been killed, he thought it was a mistake. He had just received that message from Birch that all was quiet. In a letter sent by Birch that same day to a British merchant named Bowen, he repeated his message that all was quiet and that he wanted no troops. He was even relaxed enough to ask Bowen to send him some bottled beer. That's or Allsop to be exact. That last call for a pint could only have come from a Brit. Birch's quiet confidence that he was perfectly safe is inexplicable. He had been warned several times in the weeks before that there were active plots to kill him. A trader named Diang Ismail told him that he overheard chiefs plotting to poison Birch's food. A police sergeant at Kota Stir reported plans to attack him after the Hari Raya festival on November 1st. Raja Yusof urged him to bring more troops with him to Pasir Salak. Birch dismissed them all. Maharaja Laila himself had even once sent a verbal reply to Birch's request to stop building stockades, telling Birch to get all the troops he can from England and India, and I will fight. And indeed he did. The party that left for Pasir Salak that day occupied 3 boats. Birch was accompanied by Sub-Lieutenant Abbott of the HMS Thistle as its aide-de-camp, and they both stayed in a large sampan naga or dragon boat, which mounted a 3-pounder brass gun. A sampan panjang or longboat followed, carrying 10 of the residency's Sikh guards. They were armed with Snider rifles, and the boat carried a small mortar. Another sampan panjang was used as a cooking boat. All in all, the party consisted of 40 men, including Birch's Malay interpreter, Mat Arshad, Birch's Sikh bodyguard, a Malay cook, and a few Malay boatmen. Birch's flotilla arrived at Pasir Salak just before midnight on November 1st, the first day of Hari Raya, the feast marking the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. Birch's dragon boat moored by the banks of the Perak River just beneath the very house of Maharaja Laila. A merchant visited him that night, once more urging him to leave safely. Birch smiled and replied, prophetically, "Don't trouble yourself about me. I am an old man. If I am killed, the country will become the Queen's." To his mind, the British mission was eternal, and if one Birch fell, another would take his place. The next morning, November 2nd, 1875, Lieutenant Abbott left the boat shortly after 6 a.m. to shoot birds across the river in Kampung Gajah, leaving Birch to converse with its chief, Datuk Sagor. Birch then sent a messenger to the Maharaja Laila requesting an interview, which Layla flatly refused. Unperturbed, he then ordered his Malay interpreter, Mat Arshad, to post the recently issued proclamations at a nearby Chinese goldsmith's shop. These notices were immediately torn down by a large armed crowd of Malays who had been assembled by the Maharaja Layla. With an armed Sikh orderly standing guard outside, Birch then entered a floating bathhouse constructed of flimsy matting that was moored to the riverbank. In the meantime, Arshad posted a second proclamation at the goldsmith shop. Panda Indut angrily tore it down again. Arshad allegedly then struck the man with a stick, and Panda Indut immediately stabbed the interpreter with a spear. Panda Indut then let out a cry of "Amo! Amo!" which sparked the sudden and immediate rush of the angry crowd towards the bathhouse where Birch was bathing. The signal had been given. The crowd of Malays converged on the bathhouse where Birch was bathing. He was still completely unaware of what had just transpired. Seeing a mob of angry armed Malays rushing towards him, the Sikh orderly standing guard at the entrance to the bathhouse immediately jumped into the river. He subsequently swam back to the residency, taking care to keep his revolver dry. He had not fired a single shot from it in defense of his master. Panda Indut had run down to the bathhouse with a spear in each hand, and was reported by some sources to be the first man to have speared Birch. He was joined by Ngah Jabar, Maharaja Layla's brother, who stabbed Birch with a spear, and Cik Ali, who stabbed Birch at the doorway of the bathhouse. The other Malays gathered around the bathhouse and started thrusting their spears through the flimsy mat walls. Birch fell into the water after receiving these initial spear wounds. As he came up to the surface behind the bathhouse, attempting to get to his boat, he was stabbed with a kris by a man named Tuah. The final blows were delivered by Seputum, who cut Birch over the head near the ear with a long sword, or parang lading. Birch's 10 Sikh guards were a distance away, busy cleaning their unloaded rifles and cooking breakfast. When the uproar began, they were taken completely by surprise. Upon hearing the commotion, a group of them rushed into one longboat, but there were so many of them that it capsized, forcing them to swim to another boat that had been pushed into the water by Birch's helmsman, Ahmed. Ahmed asked the sepoys to fire, and they fired a single volley, which momentarily dispersed the Malays on shore. As the boat retreated downriver, it became the target of heavy gunfire by the Malays from both banks of the river. One Sikh, Hit Ser Singh, was killed, and 3 others were wounded. Ahmed snatched the rifle from a Sikh and fired back, but the other Sikhs panicked and jumped overboard. Birch's Malay boatmen were also targets of Maharaja Layla's men, with one, Din Larut, being killed and 2 others wounded. Mat Arshad, in the meantime, was severely wounded and had crawled to the river. Ahmed and 2 other boatmen helped Mat Arshad into the escaping boat. Arshad died shortly after being pulled aboard. When Arshad's body was recovered later, it was found that he had a severe wound in the stomach, with his bowels protruding, and 2 cut wounds to the head. Lieutenant Abbott, who was shooting birds in the jungle across the river at Kampung Gajah, heard the commotion and rushed to the river. There he met Datuk Sagur, who warned him that there was a disturbance in Pasir Salak and that he should flee back into the jungle. Disregarding Datuk Sagur's advice, Abbott secured a small canoe and escaped downriver under constant fire from Malays on both banks, reaching the residency at Bandar Baru around 10:30 in the morning. Frank Swettenham, who was distributing proclamations further upstream at Kuala Kangsar, learned of the murder on November 4th as he was passing through Belanja in his boat. Swettenham suspected treachery when he was asked to land there and proceeded downriver immediately, accompanied by Raja Mahmud, the Selangor warrior who had accompanied him to Perak. Favoured by a dark, misty night, Swettenham ran the gauntlet through enemy territory, passing the scene of the murder at Pasir Salak undetected and arriving safely at the residency at Bandar Baru on the morning of November 5th. Swettenham wrote a detailed account of this daring escape in his book, Malay Sketches. When Birch's body was recovered by the British on November 6th, it was found to have received 10 spear wounds or stabs, with the worst wounds behind the neck and on the chest. His body was otherwise unmutilated, and later reports from the Singapore newspaper The Straits Observer that his feet had been cut off appear to have been unfounded. He was buried in the Bandar Baru residency grounds that same evening, where his body lies to this day. At Pasir Salak, Maharaja Lela stood before his people and proclaimed the deed as justice. He was heard to shout from the steps of his house that the murder was not done by royal decree but by their own desperate will, stating that they could not stand it any longer after other people's houses had been burned, no doubt referring to the burning of the house of Raja Ngah. He concluded saying, "If our houses are burned too, it is better we should die before that." Birch's boat was plundered. Rifles, clothes, coins, and $100 in cash were brought up to Maharaja Lela's house and divided among his men. 3 rings, including a snake pattern ring, were taken from Birch's body, and Maharaja Lela presented them to his wife. Seputum, who had struck the final sword blows, received a kris belonging to Birch. Birch's watch and gold chain were pocketed by a man named Haji Abdullah. Many years later, local villagers returned Birch's watch and pistol to his son when he visited Pasir Salak in 1883. Ernest Woodford Birch, then serving as an assistant colonial secretary, would in time assume the very office his father had once held, becoming British Resident of Perak in 1895, 20 years after that fateful day by the river. Maharaja Lela sent messengers to the Sultan and Laksmana announcing, "I have killed Birch." He sent Birch's large dragon boat upriver to the ex-Sultan Ismail as spoils of war. Flushed with triumph, he hosted a kanduri or feast and immediately focused on military preparations, ordering that stockades be built, distributing weapons, and preparing his men for an attack on the British residency at Bandar Baru that very night. The outburst of anger was now a declaration of war. Among the British, the murder provoked profound shock and anger from officials, the public, and the press. The Times in London described the murder as an outrage that was a painful shock to English feeling. It lamented that it would inevitably lead the empire to embark upon yet another little war. The Straits Times in Singapore demanded that the policy of direct intervention must now be carried through at any cost, and demanded justice and satisfaction. Englishmen cannot be murdered with impunity, it declared. In the next episode of this channel's Perak War 150th anniversary special, we shall see how the British tried to strike back quickly before the flames of rebellion could spread further. Join me on Friday, November 7th, and learn how a British force that set out to punish Pasir Salak for their act of defiance unexpectedly met disaster and humiliation at the hands of the Malays. Until then, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do consider giving the video a like, sharing it with your family and friends, giving us your thoughts in the comments below, or subscribing to join me on future adventures exploring the lost chronicles of Malayan history. I remain as ever your grateful chronicler. Cheerio.